This was signed by US, by Russia, and other allied powers. And then we go to 1948. Ito yung sa may picture na natin with Eleanor Roosevelt. Ano? Noong 1948, on December 10, nagkaroon na ng Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Paris. So there were 30 articles written for the past 2 years. It was codified. 50 countries, including the Philippines, signed this declaration. Fast forward tayo dun sa 1972. May na-elect po kasi nung panahon na yon and may na-declare na martial law. Ano yung kinalaman nito sa ating human rights? With the declaration of martial law kasi, there's what we call the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. I'll explain that more later. Ano. Pero it means kasi that civilian law was suspended. Ang sinusundan, military law. So, martial law, di ba? And then on 1986, nagkaroon ng ouster of the dictator. Cory is stated as the president. And with that came the next year, no 1987, ratification of the 1987 Constitution, including the Bill of Rights and the creation of the Commission on Human Rights. Fast forward to 2016 ulit, nagkaroon ng inauguration nung previous administration. And then, kasi based on Amnesty International and other human rights watch organizations internationally, there are some questionable laws passed during this administration and plus the added conviction of critics. And then fast forward to this year, earlier this year, nung inauguration naman ng son of former dictator, president, who is now the president. So, it's just lang din ha. Minamark lang din natin yung 22 kasi we're still observing or we're still waiting on what's gonna happen history-wise. So, ito yung parang basic timeline. Next slide. So, how do we codify the Bill of Rights? Di ba signatory tayo dun sa United Nations Declaration on Human Rights? Kaso declaration pa lang yon. How do we make the state accountable or how are we able to codify it and nasusundan natin locally dito sa ating bansa? So, sa Bill of Rights, sa Article 3 in Tagalog, katipunan ng mga karapatan. And then additionally, Article 13 sa 1987 Constitution, we have yung social justice and human rights na mga provisions. Sige. Ano ba yung basic na goal natin? Or what is the most fundamental goal when it comes to human rights? It is a life with dignity. So, Jokno, in his book ng 2011 na na-published, may equation for that daw. So, freedom of action, entitlement to goods and services, and resources, availability of resources, and our ability to access these resources equals a life with dignity. So remember this equation later. Sorry. Okay pa po ba? Next. Sige. Punta na po tayo sa... Ay, yes po. Sorry. Sige. Benguet Hub. Hello. Ay, I'm from Baguio. Wala lang. Sorry. Okay na po ba? Or may babalikan po ba from the Benguet Hub? Sige, okay po. So, sa ating classification of human rights, we have yung different generations or what we call the intergenerationality. So, first gen of human rights, we have what we call the base rights, which are the right to life, included doon yung food, shelter, and basic liberty. When you live naman, syempre, nag-iisip ka rin, you participate in society, so kasama dyan yung civil rights, and yung political rights. Yun yung first gen na rights natin. Next, dun sa generationality or second gen na human rights, K-pop na K-pop, no? First gen, second gen, third gen. Second gen naman yung sa economic rights natin, other social rights, and cultural rights. Tapos, pagdating na sa third gen, ito yung sa rights at a collective level for communities, population, societies, or nations. Yung distinction kasi natin dito, sa first gen, how we are ourselves, personally as human. Sa second gen, how we relate to our immediate community. And then dun sa third gen, how our community relates to other communities. In recognition Sige. So, we discussed now our first generation, right? So, sa life, health, food, shelter, education, and then self-determination. You would see that they are co-equal, not one without the other. We have to remember that every human right that we have, they're all interconnected and interpersonal. The loss or the limitation of one human right will lead to the loss or limitation of another. May domino effect yan. So, pagdating sa right to life, it includes the right to live. Paano siya na-codify or sa ating constitution? Yung ating clause na right to life clause, right to life, liberty, and due process of law. Siyempre, nabubuhay ka, kailangan mong kumain, kailangan healthy and helpful yung ating economy and yung environment. So, with the right to life, the right to health also comes with it. And paano to na-codify sa ating constitution? Yung right to healthful ecology, which is what we're here for din, para sa rights of nature. Okay. And then, pag healthful ecology, related din dito yung sa food, adequate food sources, di ba? Kasi food is a national security issue. Pag hindi mo napapakain yung citizenry mo, pag nanghina yung citizenry mo, prone to attack from other nations. Yung sa tinatakot ko kayo. So, paano siya na-codify yung ating right to food? Yung sa CARP, which is the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, and then yung pag-subsidize sa ating agricultural sector. So, you have your right to life, to health, to food, and then to adequate shelter. Paano siya na-codify? Socialized housing through urban land reform and other housing benefits na ino-offer dapat ng ating government. Okay, so you now have your basic needs, nabubuhay, may pagkain, may shelter, may damit. Ano pa yung kailangan? Siyempre, yung development ng brain and nung consciousness nung tao. So, you have the right to education and quality education dapat. So, paano to na-codify or ano yung dinidictate ng ating constitution pagdating sa education? Kailangan socialize yung education natin. Dapat lahat may access sa safe education. And then when we say integrated, yung curricula ng schools, pare-parehas dapat. So that more or less at the same level yung learning ng mga citizens. And then after education, syempre pag natuto ka na, the right to self-determination or the right to decide for yourself. This also includes yung right sa movement and practice. Ayoko nang tumira ng Baguio, lumipat akong Manila, or ayoko na dito sa Manila, gusto kong lumipat sa Baguio. Just the right to determine how to live your life with limitations, of course. So, dun sa sinasabi, paano siya na-codify, lalo na sa ating constitution, yung right not to be disturbed in the exercise of this right. So, in a way, walang pakialamanan or the state does not do anything. That's one thing to remember kasi pagdating sa first generation rights, yung role ng state dito ay largely negative. Ibig sabihin, wala dapat ginagawa ang state para pakialaman ang mga karapatan na ito. So next po natin, sa first gen rights natin. Ano pa yung included? After the base rights. So voting and suffrage. We are a democratic country, so the population has the right to elect their representatives that they best feel na would also parang magiging allies nila in their beliefs. Tapos, ano pa ba pag voting and suffrage? After that, we have the right to assembly or the right of the people to come together and petition the government for the redress of their grievances. Yung karapatan natin mag-speak out and mag-rally and to join movements that are aligned with our beliefs as long as hindi rin siya as long as it's not also parang an illegal na assembly or for an illegal purpose. And then, ano pa ba yung sa first generation rights natin, which are also related to our right to self-determination, our right for the practice of religion, or even the non-practice thereof. So, ibig sabihin nito that no state funds must be used to favor a certain religion or a sect. Pagdating kasi sa belief ng mga tao, hindi dapat pinapakailaman ng state. And then yung pera ng state, hindi din dapat napupunta for any one particular religion. Kasi nga, that might also offend the others, di ba? So yun yung complicated doon. And then the next is freedom of expression. Related din dun sa freedom of assembly. And then it comes as a result of your right to self-determination. So freedom from restriction, free thought and exchange of ideas. Ang update kasi dito, this was last updated, I think 1980 something. So we now have what we call yung gender spectrum din natin, di ba? Bilang youth, I think, lalo sa mga Gen Z, they understand this more than any other generation. This should also include yung sa right to expression, gender expression, or how I want to communicate myself to the world. So, yan yung sa sinasabi natin na other first generation rights. Okay po ba? Just let me know lang po sa chat ha kung mabilis. So, we go to the right to life. Biglang Tagalog, ano? Right to life ay karapatan na mabuhay ng maayos at may katiyakan na maprotektahan ng gobyerno ang kaligtasan ng bawat tao. Do you mind if I take off my mask? Sorry, Kim. Sige. Ayan. Kaya nagiging human rights violation ang mga extrajudicial killings kasi the loss of life, the loss of property, or the loss of the protection should be under the due process of law. Pag basta-basta kang pinapatay or pag bastang patayan na nangyayari, you lose your right to life which is inherent. Ayan siya. So, yun yung explanation natin sa right to life. And then, in relation to that, yung sa right to due process. So, makatwiran ba yung action ng gobyerno or nasunod ba yung tamang proseso? When we say due process, there are two kinds of due process contemplated under our laws. We have substantive due process and procedural due process. So, pag sinabing substantive due process, we go to the meat of the matter. Yung deprivation ba of life, liberty, or property, is it justifiable ba? So, anong example dito? Yung sa anti-drugs law natin, kasi nga drugs are known to be addicting and then yung effects niya, hindi siya productive or conducive to society. Mas harmful yung effects niya. So, that's why there are laws passed against the use of these illegal drugs and then makatwiran ba yung gobyerno. And then when we say procedural process, ito na yung very technical. Kasi pag procedural, it means notice and hearing. So, nasunod ba ang tamang proseso? Now, why are these important? Kasi for every law passed by Congress, it has to follow these requirements na may substantive due process and may procedural due process. Okay, next slide. Right to equal protection of the laws naman. Pagkapantay-pantay ng mga tao sa mata ng batas. So, pwede po ba magkaroon ng recitation part dito? Okay lang ba? Sige po. Or sagutin niyo na lang ano. So, pag sinabi nating right to equal protection, sa trabaho po, dapat po hindi nagde-discriminate ang employers between male and female unless super laki na po ng distinction. So, and then when it comes to our labor laws din po, pag mga babae, may maternity leave. Pero pag mga lalaki, paternity leave po, di ba? Pero pagdating kasi sa maternity leave ng mga babae, mas mahaba yung recovery period nila. Siyempre, sila yung nagluwal ng bata. Sila yung nagpanganak ng bata. Okay pa, tayo doon. Another one is for the program ng 4Ps, which is considered as one of the longest running social action programs from previous presidents. If you would see kasi, right to equal protection of the laws does not mean equal application of the laws for everyone. Equity yung hinahanap natin dito. So on the left, we have si nanay from our LMs kasi she's a 4P beneficiary. On the right po, we have a celebrity personality. Do you think na violate yung right ng celebrity personality yung sa equal protection pag hindi siya nagiging beneficiary ng 4P? Di ba hindi? Kasi yung disparity between their lifestyles and income. What the state aims to protect is that, or what the state aims is to equalize that para both can afford a life with dignity. Right against unreasonable searches and seizures. This is just Section 2 of the Bill of Rights. Nasa Section 2 pa lang po tayo, out of 30 plus. So, ang search and seizure ay dapat na isinasagawa ng mga state agents sa tamang proseso. So, we go back ulit po dun sa procedural process and substantive due process. So, ano yung significance po pagdating dito? Freedom or liberty of the people is of utmost importance. It should be also the guiding principle pagdating sa ating mga state authorities. Pag nakita po na unlawful yung search and seizure and na-raise po ito sa court and it is proven, dismissed po yung kaso. Ganon siya ka-importante na kailangan sundan. Kasi, sino ba yung may state resources? Di ba po yung mga authorities? So, sino po dapat yung mag-conduct ng sarili nila with the highest obligation or highest respect din dapat for human rights? Yung authorities. Kasi sino po yung nagbabayad ng sahod nila? Di po ba yung population through the payment of taxes? That's why. Next na rin po ay yung freedom of speech natin. So, what the Constitution aims to restrict here lang is yung harmful or hurtful speech. Ito yung seditious or libelous na speech natin. Otherwise po, freedom of speech applicable for all. Okay. So for example po, yung mga tweets na activism or raising concerns for mga public issues, this isn't really, this is one of the exercises of the right to freedom of speech. This isn't exactly a violation. Whereas ito, I will give 50 million reward kung sinong makakapatay dun sa former president. That's already, that's not an exercise of the freedom of speech, no? Kasi it is harmful na. So, mako-consider to as grave threat. Yun yung, andun yung distinction. Sige. So, next slide po. Next naman po, again, sa right to association natin, we're allowed to form unions, join religious sects with share our belief. Aspeto ng kalayaang pumasok sa ating isang kasunduan or pagpapahayag at paniniwala. Kasali dito ang karapatan bumuo ng union sa trabaho at sa komunidad. This is especially important for labor workers din kasi if they form a union, pag collective bargaining, they can argue as one unit that is more or less equal to the power of the employer. Kaya natin pinopromote din yung right to association. Pero pag yung formulation ng association ninyo ay to commit a crime or for other nefarious means, hindi na siya yung valid exercise of your right to association. Now we go, okay na po tayo for the first generation rights. Sige. Any questions po, palagay na lang sa chat so we can discuss after. We go now to our second generation rights, which are the economic, and then economic 2. Ito yung sa social security, access to resources, right to employment, freedom from discrimination, right to housing and clothing. And then dun naman sa cultural rights natin, every country is presumed to be multicultural. So pag sinasabi natin cultural, in the interest of preserving and protecting mankind and its culture, kasama dapat sa karapatan natin yung sa protection of ating culture, including our practices and preservation of land, yung mga sa indigenous people natin, And then pagdating din naman sa social, related dito yung adequate healthcare, subsidized access to facilities, and better standard of living. Sometimes kasi, these economic, cultural, and social rights, they're interchanged, but more or less same yung sinasabi nila. Again, we go back to the principle nga that all our rights are interconnected. The loss of one will lead to the loss of the others. Pag nawala yung economic rights natin, for example, yung sa preservation of land natin, nawala doon sa ating mga indigenous people, they cannot practice their culture and then they cannot go on with life as they know it. So mahirap silang i-assimilate na naman doon sa parang doon sa general public. Pag nahirapan sila, mapipilayan yung culture not only of the Philippines, but sometimes din kasi yung mga IP na to, for environmental rights, sila yung nagproprotekta. So pag nawala yung protectors natin for these indigenous lands din, domino effect na yan, nakikita natin. And then when we say third generation rights naman, it is our response to global interdependence. Since individual states cannot resolve problems in isolation from the international community. If you would notice kasi yung mga closed off na countries, yun din yung may pinakamaraming human rights violation. So for example, we call it the Hermit Kingdom, North Korea. And then you would hear reports nga, diba, of other human rights violations. So other countries become watchdogs for other countries, lalo na sa mga developed countries. So paano nako-codify or how do we how do we join these other countries pagdating sa ating mga human rights? Usually in the form of agreements. Pag sinabing agreement, minsan interregional to. For example, yung mga ASEAN na mga sports meets natin or yung mga trade agreements sa pag-region. Less formal siya. Pag sinabi naman nating convention, bilateral agreements or formed by multilateral treaties. For example, yung UNCLOS or United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea. So yung mga pumirma ng agreement na yon, they are bound by that convention. Another is a charter, so particularly for formal and solemn instruments. Parang yung declaration ng UN, the UN charter that we follow. So we have to follow the rules and regulations ng UN. And then we go to the declarations. It's used for a variety of agreements, but not necessarily legally binding. Legally blinding. Ang mga example ng declarations ay, for example, may nagkaroon ng refugee crisis, and then this particular country is gonna say, oh, we're gonna declare na we cannot accept any more refugees, kailangan ibang countries naman have to shoulder it. We are bound by that sort of declaration. Pero the UN can censure it naman. And then another way of how our human rights are connected globally is through protocols. So it is a framework of agreements siya. For example, yung Kyoto Protocol to lessen yung carbon emissions ng mga tao. Related dito din yung sa Paris Protocol natin. And then you also have treaties or instruments with certain characteristics, mga peace treaties or economic treaties. So for example, magpapadala dito ng ganitong product yung isang country and vice versa, ito yung ipapadala natin, mga tax-free, ganun siya. So this is how we relate to other communities, and this is how they respect then our rights with the belief na if they respect our human rights while they are on our soil, vice versa din, na they will respect the human rights of our people when we are on their soil. So we go now back nationally, ano yung obligations ng ating state, at least when it comes to our human rights. So respect, fulfill, and protect. So respetuhin, tuparin, at protektahan. It's a cycle, ano, the obligation or the role of the citizen is to claim and assert the rights from the state, and the state is to fulfill their obligations to the citizens. Sige, picturean niyo muna. Okay, next slide na natin. So, what happens pag nagkaroon ng human rights violation? Ano muna ang human rights violation? So, in the Philippine context or sa national context natin, it is the failure of the state to promote its obligation to respect, fulfill, and protect the fundamental rights of its population. It is also the failure of the state to intervene, act, or ensure that the victim is given justice. Human rights violations can either be the result of commission, which is a positive act of the state, or omission, failure of the state agent to do their duty. So, ito yung mga examples niya. For example, commission, a variety of extrajudicial killings, or may rise in illegal arrest or illegal search and seizure, illegal detention, or torture. Ito yung mga nakikita sa mga news, ano? And then, pagdating naman sa omission, no investigation of reported crimes or failure to intervene in reported mass killings or not providing basic public services to those who are not voters. We go to the commission, lalo na extrajudicial killings. Lately kasi nakikita natin, given the past few years, napaparami siya. So, bakit nga gan siya extrajudicial killing? We go to our Bill of Rights and we go to our state policies. So, state policies natin kasi civilian liberty is at times must be upholded. Civilian liberty is more superior, parang ganun siya, no? So, ang ibig sabihin nito, we value the most the life, liberty, and the property of our people. Yung mga extrajudicial killing, they are unlawful deprivation of these rights. So, pag ginagawa to, lalo na ng mga alleged state forces na walang authority, may authority pero hindi sumusunod sa tamang proseso, it is still a human rights violation. Ang laki kasi ng disparity eh. It's like you have the ordinary citizen versus the entire state machinery. And and then, medyo nakakalimutan din ata, just a reminder lang, the state machinery exists because of its citizens. The salaries of these authorities, of these public figures, are built or are taken from the labor of its citizens. So, ayan siya, no? Pag omission naman, no investigation of reported crimes, it is also considered as a human rights violation. Again, kasi it is the state who has resources. We had this client, na allegedly vigilante killing yung anak niya, 14 years old. Went to the police office, went to the precinct to report yung killing nung anak niya kasi na-discover lang. Sorry, it's early in the morning, Ang sabi sa kanya ng police officer, wala, ganyan talaga. Ano gusto mo gawin namin? Word for word, yun yung sinabi sa kanya ng police officer. Nung police officer, ibalik ko lang emphasize natin. Di ba trabaho ng police is to serve and protect the citizens. Ayan. We have din naman yung omission, failure to intervene in reported mass killings or pag sa mga riots, for example, in one area, dapat nagpapadala yung state ng mga ng forces nila or authority nila to maintain order and discipline. And then others naman is not providing basic public services to those who are not voters. That's a state omission kasi nga the state is obligated to provide for its citizens because of the principle of parents patriae. So the state is the second parent of all its citizens. So may mga reported din nung time ng pandemic, may mga hindi nakatanggap ng ayuda for the simple reason na hindi sila botante dun sa area na yon. So that's also an omission. That's considered a human rights violation. Bakit siya human rights violation? Kasi nga, the state is obligated to respect, fulfill, and protect the human rights, all the rights of its citizens. Yun lang naman talaga dito Kaya umiikot. So again, we see the distinction, if it's the government, or kapag bahagi ng gobyerno ang nag-abuso ng tao, ito ay isang human rights violation. Saan natin siya nire-report, at least sa Pilipinas, sa Commission on Human Rights. So, government or state agent yung nag-commit ng crime, human rights violation sa CHR. Meron naman pag private person yung nag-commit, ito ay isang krimen. Kapag civilian o pribadong tao ang nang-rape, pumatay, or iba pang nag-commit ng crime, sa pulis ka dapat magpunta para i-report to. So government, if the government yung may kasalanan, human rights violation. Pag pribadong tao yung may kasalanan, it's considered a crime. At least for the Philippine context, ito yung paano siya legally, saan mo nire-report. Kasi 'di ba, you have I'm sorry to remind you, pero 'di ba there was this case before of this girl whose face parang was half burned in Cebu, and people were asking, asa na yung CHR? Asa na yung CHR? When that's not the mandate of the CHR. Dapat mandate yan ng ating PNP. So, I hope clear yung distinction, at least for the at least in the Philippine context. So, okay po ba tayo dito? So, din po yung basic overview natin ng ating human rights. We go back to this lang muna, balikan ko lang by way of review, dito sa ating classification of human rights. Again, we have our first gen, second gen, and third gen. First gen is how we relate personally. We are alive. These are our basic needs, and then these are for our expression. Sa second gen naman is how we relate to others, and then pagdating sa third gen, how our communities relate to other communities. Ngayon, what is the importance of claiming these rights? Ayan. Ano to? If you would notice kasi we have what we call our shrinking civic spaces. If you say something against lang or medyo critical of the administration or the previous administration, automatic nare-red tag ka na or automatic na subversive ka. And when if in fact you were just stating an opinion or that you feel na personal sa'yo na ganito. And then we also have kasi the failure of the state to protect the rights of its citizens, such as access to food. So what happens here? If you keep them busy with their basic needs or lack of basic needs, they will forget about the freedom that they have lost. So nangyayari ngayon, every time you try to express your opinion, nadi-demonize ka. Or kaya every time you try to say na, hindi dapat ganito, parang, ay, di ko na matalino, di ba? We shame pa intellect or any form of freedom of expression when that shouldn't be the case. Sige. So, okay na po tayo sa distinction. So, how do we advocate for human rights? Or how do we empower the youth? Okay, sige. First, education, education, education. I don't know if you know Sir Maki. Si Sir Maki. He's our senior legal consultant kasi. And he advocates for this kasi. You never stop learning. You consume as much material as you can. You educate yourselves. It is your right kasi, and it is your privilege. And it's something that's never taken away from you. I cannot believe I am quoting my father on that. Sabi niya talaga, kaya ako pinilit mag-aral. The next is you have to empathize with others. We see kasi yung collective memory ng Pilipinas, medyo flexible, for lack of a better term. Kasi it makes you understand more when you empathize with others. Kasi nung panahon nung ganito, sabi naman ng lolo ko, okay lang. Whereas you have entire family suffering naman on the other side. No na your way of thinking kasi is only limited to you. So that's why empathy is greater, or why there's a need to empathize with others. And then you have to understand nga that there are uncomfortable truths talaga na you have to sit with it, learn with it, and then that's when you find a solution. Another thing in how do we advocate for human rights is to check your privilege. 'Di ba? Accessibility should be everyone's priority. So, kung ngayon pa lang ma-inculcate natin sa ating mga kabataan, the best way to make sure that a nation is progressive or takes care of its citizens, the thinking that you should have is you have to find whoever it is the most neglected by society. Whoever she is, wherever she is, if her rights are protected, then everyone's rights are protected. So check your privilege. And then, do not look away. Doon tayo sa right side, sa side na to. Do not look away. You have to witness the atrocities of the world talaga. Because you have to remember. So, I have this friend kasi that I'm quoting her. She said, justice is not looking away. In one of its smallest senses, justice is not looking away. So, kung may nangyayari, di ba, pag nagiging viral, pag nado-document ng mga tao and nagiging viral, that's how you hold people to accountability. Kasi nahihiya sila when the world is watching. Another thing is that you have to be humble. You have to be teachable enough to see things from a different perspective. So, along with empathizing with others and your education should never be a stepping stone by which you look down on others, di ba? So, be teachable enough to see things from a different perspective. And then another thing is remembering. You have to denounce fake news and unchecked claims kasi daming kumakalat. It's so easy to say kasi na, ganito naman yung yari eh. And also in the practice of law, if you say enough things with confidence, they will believe you. They really will. Kaya lalo pag may attorney na naka-attach doon sa pangalan mo. Not to discredit me ngayon, of course. Joke lang po, Yoli. But ayun. And the last one kasi is you have to resist and speak up. So, from one generation to another generation, we have to remember that not all generations are perfect, and yet palala ng palala. Ang tawag dito, a failure of one generation na i-inherit ng next na generation. So, why do we have to speak up or why do we have to resist? Kasi there will be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice. But there must never be a time when we fail to protest. Kasi if you look away, you cannot claim na hindi mo alam. That's why, again, do not look away. So, this quote is from Elie Wiesel. He's a Holocaust survivor, and also advocating for resisting and speaking up. Another thing na hindi ko nailagay dito kasi is that your courage to speak up should, I know sometimes na there are things na you feel na you are alone, but you're never really alone. So there must always be courage to speak up kasi your courage can also encourage others. 'di ba? Damay-damay, damay-damayan lang. So why do we advocate for human rights, or what are the importance of knowing our rights? Kasi a knowledgeable citizenry is an empowered citizenry. Kasi if we know our rights, what do? We can demand transparency. Or for example, 'di ba, pag meron tayong, or pag alam natin na ito yung karapatan natin, hindi ka matatakot agad eh. 'Di ba? So an example of this is pag hinuli ka, walang warrant of arrest, sumama ka na lang bigla. That's already questionable. So pag sinabi mo hinuli po ako ng walang warrant, dismissed yung kaso, kakasuhan pa yung nanghuli sa'yo. Hindi alam yun ng mga tao eh, natatakot na agad sila. Pero if you have knowledge, you are empowered kasi. And when you are empowered, you can demand transparency. And then if you know our rights, demand transparency, demand goods and services. Sa amin nanggagaling yung pangsweldo ninyo. Ba't kayo naglalandian dyan sa Kongreso? Parang ganun, di ba? Saan napupunta yung pera namin? So, kasi guys, you can just imagine kasi there are allegations na yung iba, 'di ba, the law only says up to 13th month pay. There are allegations na parang magkakaroon ng 15th month, 'di ba? 15th month, 16th month, built on the backs of its population who are currently suffering. So if we know our rights, then we can combat ignorance and oppression. An ignorant population is an oppressed population, 'di ba? So hindi na sila lumalaban kasi nga hindi ko naman alam, 'di ba? May mga ganun na nangyayari. And the more na you don't push back, the more na naaabuso yung mga nangyayari na to. And then if we know our rights, we can hold the state accountable. Again, yung relationship kasi ng population with the state, it is very dependent. The state is dependent on its population, di ba? It is the population that provides everything, parang the taxes, the manpower, the workforce. So if we know our rights, the better position we are to demand them. So balikan natin to, 'di ba? If you keep them busy with their basic needs, they will forget about the freedom they lost. So I hope you remember that you have lost any freedom, maalala niyo siya ngayon. So, the rule of law and human rights kasi, they are both sides of the same coin. Walang karapatang pantao kung hindi mananaig ang batas, at hindi mananaig ang batas kung walang karapatang pantao. Bakit kasi kailangan na simultaneous or both sides of the same coin? Kasi the rule of law should only have really, for its most basic goal, people with a life of dignity. Pag wala kang human rights, wala ka namang life of dignity, 'di ba? And then how do we enforce these human rights? How do we account, or how do we demand these human rights? Through the rule of law, 'di ba? Para pantay-pantay lahat. Thank you. And with that, thank you so much po. I hope may natutunan kayo just for a little bit. This is our mascot. So wait, Sir Hector, I'm legally required to plug this. So we have a legal chat bot. So kung gusto niyo maka-chat ang aming mga lawyers, or you have any other legal questions or concerns, we have the Tisha Hustisha chatbot. Free of charge po yung pag-consult sa aming mga lawyers. Ayan siya. So yan na po siya. I will now be taking any questions po if you have for human rights. Oh hindi, sorry, last na. If you also want lectures on other topics, available din po kami sa Ideals to conduct these with you. Sa yun, may pa-bingo pa and stuff. Not the sugal, but yung theoretical bingo. So I hope you guys have learned something. I hope this empowers you to empower others. And I hope that you never forget na you all have human rights and that we must all fight for them. So nasa isang laban lang tayo. Thank you so much. Good morning.